So my name is Tom Burke. I'm the organizational secretary of the Freedom Road Socialist Organization. I'd like to welcome all the members to our general meeting here on Zoom. Today we have a very special guest, Carlos Martinez, an author all the way from London. He's written an excellent book called The East is Still Red, Chinese Socialism in the 21st Century, and it's published by Praxis Press. Carlos is also the co-editor of the Friends of Socialist China. So if you are looking for more information, you might search for that, the Friends of Socialist China. And he has a previous publication, another book, The End of the Beginning, Lessons of the Soviet Collapse. So two books on the two most important experiences with socialism. We've written about his book in Fight Back News, which everyone here should read. Josh Sykes reviewed it a while back, and that's still available online. We actually have a new website for Fight Back that we're very excited about and very proud of, and makes it easier to use on your phone or other handheld devices. And we need your help for getting our articles out there and helping to spread the word. With Carlos's book, you know, we're going to be talking today and looking for people that ask questions and express their views about China and socialism. From our seat here in the United States, we see that there's a ramping up of anti-China rhetoric, sort of a new Cold War that's being waged. And it goes beyond propaganda. There's provocations being taken against China by the United States. You know, US Navy ships going through the South China Seas where they don't belong. You know, US bases being built around the edges of China everywhere that they'll be allowed. The US funds and pushes forward separatist movements, and as well as, you know, arresting Chinese nationals who are studying in the US, accusing them of all sorts of things, but particularly claiming that they're spying, with very little evidence in the court cases if people care to look at them. So a few things before we hand it over to Carlos. We're at an extraordinary time in our lives. The Al-Aqsa flood, the Palestinian rebellion that's happening, is like nothing we've ever seen in our lifetimes. And it's a great time to be part of that and be in solidarity with it. And as I said at a speech yesterday in my small city that had 300 people at it, I said, we are part of that flood. You know, we're part of the worldwide movement that is supporting Palestinian liberation. And then we want to see them meet with success. So we're asking members to make sure you're, you know, out there in the streets protesting, you're helping to organize. If you're not connected, show up and ask what you can do to help out and become part of the organizing of this movement. We have to stop US funding. We have to stop the US military from going to war in the Middle East again. They've really never stopped with Syria and Iraq, but they can be driven out. You know, Afghanistan showed that the US can be defeated in our life, you know. So we have good friends over in Palestine with the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. So check it out, read about them, promote their statements, read Fight Back News. I also want to mention that next weekend, the National Alliance Against Racism and Political Repression is holding its conference in Chicago, and we're a big part of that conference. On Friday night, we're going to have an extraordinary rally. Angela Davis will speak by video. We'll have Frank Chapman speaking. We'll have the mayor of Chicago, who will help to open the event, as well as the president of the Chicago Teachers Union and other important trade union leaders. So show up in Chicago Friday night, figure out how to get there. If you need help or housing, you can ask us to figure it out with you. but we'll have hopefully 1,000 or more people there, and it'll be a great rally and then a big weekend for organizing against police killings, police crimes, against political repression. The other things we have coming up is next July 17th, we're going to have the March on the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee, which we will help to lead with a bunch of other groups from across the United States. We're going to hold a planning conference in February in Milwaukee when it's nice and cold. So get ready to come to our conference in Milwaukee. If you're looking for snow and ice, that'll be the place to be. The other thing is in August, we're also going to help lead the march on the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. So maybe back to back, you get to go to Milwaukee and then a few weeks later to Chicago to help us protest. And we promise that both of those will be good. If you want to know what our electoral policy is, it's to build the mass movements and march at these conventions so that both parties have to respond to the agenda of the working people of this country and to the oppressed people as well. So with that, I'm going to leave it there, and please welcome Carlos. Give your round of applause for Carlos and take it away, my friend. Glad to have you here.
Thank you so much, Tom, and thank you, comrades, for inviting me to speak with you today. And I just want to kind of, for what it's worth, give my support to the remarks Tom made in his introduction in relation to the heroic and inspiring resistance of the Palestinian people, who are really blazing a trail for us worldwide at the moment. So I'm just going to spend between 20-25 minutes talking about what the book is, why I wrote it, the East is Still Red, Chinese Socialism in the 21st Century. And then I guess we're going to have time for questions, answers, and a general, hopefully pretty wide-ranging discussion. So why write this book? There's a lot of books on China. It's a pretty crowded marketplace. You can look at the Amazon bestsellers list for books about China, and there's plenty there. There's how the CCP is reshaping the world. There's China's new tyranny. There's how China took over while America's elite slept. And literally dozens of books, big best-selling books, telling you all about how China is a dystopian, authoritarian, aggressive, reactionary state. A kind of modern hell on earth, essentially. So this is a very crowded marketplace. Much less crowded of a marketplace is books that talk about China's dramatic achievements on multiple dimensions, that talk about its successes in relation to poverty alleviation, improving living standards, green energy, tackling COVID, and so on. Less crowded of a marketplace is for books that talk about China's multipolar strategy and its foreign policy in general. So I really had two key motivations for writing the book. One, to tell the truth about China and to oppose this intense propaganda war that's going on in relation to China. Secondly, to talk about the social nature of China, what system of political economy is in operation in China, because there's a huge amount of confusion on that question. So in relation to the Cold War and the propaganda war, especially over the last few years, over the last, let's say, 5, 6, 7 years, the number of incredible, unbelievable slanders that have been thrown at China, and thrown so repeatedly that they've acquired the force of fact in the popular mind frame to some degree. We're told to believe that China is conducting a genocide in Xinjiang against the Uyghur Muslim population, or if it's not conducting a genocide, then it's conducting a cultural genocide, which is an equally ridiculous assertion, but also use of that expression, cultural genocide. I was talking with a friend of mine, a Jewish friend, who said, 2 of my grandparents died in the Nazi Holocaust. If you'd asked them if they could choose a cultural genocide instead of an actual genocide, that would have been a pretty easy choice for them. But, you know, we're told, okay, well, one step down from genocide, if China's not conducting that, is cultural genocide. We're told that China's cracking down on religious freedoms. We're told that China's cracking down on indigenous languages in Tibet, in Inner Mongolia, in Xinjiang. We're told that China's trapping the countries of Africa, Latin America, the Pacific, the Caribbean, the Middle East in debt traps, that it's engaged in spying, that's, you know, it's engaged in espionage activities against Britain, against the US, against the European Union, and so on and so forth. You know, they're spying on us because they want to take away our freedoms. They're using spy balloons that then turn out to be exactly what the Chinese said they were, i.e. meteorological devices. They're taking our jobs, they're stealing our technology, they're ramping up for a war to take back Taiwan. And, you know, this is, all of this propaganda is essentially part of a new Cold War. It's a propaganda war which functions as war propaganda. They're trying to get the public, the masses in the West, on side with their attacks on China, with their new Cold War on China, and potentially going forward with a hot war on China. And that is all about essentially the US ruling class, with the help of its allies, such as Britain, such as the EU, such as Canada, such as Australia, attempting to maintain their hegemony. It's an extension of what was called by the neocons back in the Bush days, the Project for a New American Century. And if you look at the characteristics of this new Cold War, it's actually very, very similar to the original Cold War in terms of, you know, there are two main thrusts to it. Firstly, attacking socialism and trying to weaken the socialist world through arms race, through propaganda war, through inciting counter-revolution, through destabilization, through sanctions, through economic coercion. And then attacking national sovereignty of the peoples, trying to maintain this imperialist structure in place through wars and through proxy wars and through coups and through assassinations. And, you know, I sometimes question the terminology of Cold War and New Cold War, because it makes it sound kind of pretty innocuous. You know, Cold War, well, it sounds much better than a hot war. But if you look at the original Cold War, it wasn't all that cold. For 3 million Koreans, it was pretty damn hot, you know, in a war that was waged specifically so that the US could have a foothold in the Pacific, so that it could place its nuclear warheads and its troops and its military bases in a position to surround the Soviet Union and to surround China, i.e. the big socialist countries, and so that the US could support Taiwan's kind of de facto independence and prevent the reunification of China. You know, the Cold War wasn't very cold for 4 million people in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, a war which was waged by the US in order to prevent a country from choosing its own development path, from taking a sovereign decision to adopt a socialist system and to align itself with the socialist countries. For the people of Angola, people of Brazil, Guatemala, Chile, Indonesia, Nicaragua, Mozambique, and many others, you know, it was a hot war. Millions and millions of lives were sacrificed for what today we call the rules-based world order. And, you know, currently, as it stands, this new Cold War against China isn't all that hot, although I would argue that the new Cold War is also being waged against Russia, and it's certainly hot in Ukraine right now. But aside from the economic aspects that are currently primary, the trade war, the tariffs, the attempts to prevent China from getting advanced semiconductors, the attempts to keep Huawei out of network infrastructure in various countries in the world, and so on, there's also an escalating military component, the formation of this AUKUS military nuclear pact, essentially between Australia, Britain, and the US. Direct military aid for the first time to Taiwan, the incitement and encouragement of Taiwanese separatism, the increased number of bases surrounding China, the encouragement of Japan to rearm and to break from its peace constitution, the revival of the Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, the development and positioning and deployment of the THAAD, so-called missile defense systems in Guam and South Korea, nuclear-enabled weapons and bases in Japan, South Korea, Guam, and Okinawa. And, you know, I think there's a pretty vocal faction, a significant minority in the US ruling class that recognizes that the new Cold War actually isn't going to work, and the kind of Reagan playbook of arms race and sanctions and so on, the so-called full court press that was used against the Soviet Union is not actually going to work against the PRC, which leaves only one real option if the US is going to retain its supremacy, if the US is going to retain its domination, its hegemony, if this kind of current US-led imperialist system is going to stay in place, is going to be held in place, and China's rise is going to be suppressed, then I think there is a significant section of the ruling class that has come to terms with the idea that that's only going to happen through a hot war against China, so a hot war between two nuclear powers, which would very obviously be devastating for humanity. So, you know, this is all very dangerous and should concern us and should concern all sensible and progressive and peace-loving people around the world. Apart from anything else, we're at a juncture in history where global cooperation at some level is actually an existential question, given what's going on with the climate, given what's going on with pandemics, given the threat of nuclear proliferation and nuclear war. Some level of meaningful global cooperation is necessary, and that becomes very difficult in a situation of hybrid war being waged by one country against another country or another set of countries. So, you know, that was one of the really important motivations, I think, for writing the book, is to expose this new Cold War, is to expose the propaganda war, to counter some lies, and to say to people, let's not allow our consent to be manufactured in this escalating hostility, in this campaign of containment and encirclement of China. The other key motivation, I would say, for writing the book is that, well, I'm a socialist, I'm a communist, I'm a Marxist. And if you look at China's incredible achievements on multiple dimensions, do I think it's sensible or reasonable to let capitalism take the credit for those achievements? Like, if you consider, for example, poverty alleviation, you know, the official World Bank figure is that 850 million people in China have been lifted out of poverty. It's recognized by the UN as the greatest poverty alleviation experience in history. And it's been achieved on the basis of the hard work of the Chinese people and the strategic leadership of the Chinese government. You know, we live in the West. You guys, I'm assuming the vast majority live in the United States. I live in Britain. These are imperialist countries, relatively prosperous countries, but that prosperity has its counterpart in deep poverty and oppression and exploitation around the world. You know, US hegemony and US's position at the top of the imperialist world system is based on, to a significant degree, war and mass murder and pillage and exploitation and economic coercion and dollar hegemony, etc. So what China has achieved is, you know, has managed to go from being a very poor country, one of the poorest countries in the world, to being a high middle income country and on the cusp of being a high income country, and has solved certain questions that very few other countries have solved, including our own countries, like the question of homelessness. It's been able to do that whilst pursuing a foreign policy based on peace and multipolarity and non-interference and peaceful coexistence. It's my very strongly held view that it would be absolutely impossible for China to do what it's done in terms of poverty alleviation and improving the living conditions of its people if it were a capitalist country. If the capitalist class was the ruling class in China, if the capitalist class, the people who own and deploy capital, were able to make decisions about how to use resources in China. If you look at what China's achieved in terms of the environment, it produces more renewable energy than all of the G7 countries combined. Its coal usage, like the prominence of coal in its energy mix, has gone from over 80% about 20 years ago to under 50% now, and continuing to decline rapidly. Its forest coverage has gone from 12% 40 years ago to double that, like 23, 24% now. 98% of the electric buses in the world are produced in China. 2/3 of the high-speed rail in the world, which is electric, potentially fully sustainable technology, is found in China. It's announced these targets of reaching carbon peak by 2030 and net zero by 2060, which, if it achieves them, and China does have something of a record of meeting its goals, then will be by far the shortest time period, by far the shortest duration between maximum carbon usage and zero carbon usage in history. And you have to ask, why is it China that's making this progress? Why isn't my country, why isn't Britain making that type of progress? Britain is a rich country. The United States is a rich country with lots of resources, advanced technology. The world has known about these problems for a long time. It's since, let's say 1991, 1992, the Rio summit, when it was agreed by basically all the countries in the world that there's been a consensus on the science and what we need to do in order to prevent climate collapse, in order to prevent climate catastrophe. Why haven't, but Britain and the US and the EU have left this problem to the market. We've been told, well, don't worry, the mechanics of supply and demand will mean that this problem gets solved. And 30 years later, the problem isn't anywhere near solved. The problem's got significantly worse than it was. So, there's got to be a reason that it's China that's made unprecedented progress in terms of poverty alleviation and in terms of improving people's living standards. There's got to be a reason that China's the undisputed world leader in renewable energy and biodiversity protection. There's got to be a reason that China, of all countries, has gone from being a technologically backward and one of the poorest countries in the world in 1949 to being now a science and technology powerhouse and on the cusp of being a high-income country. There's got to be a reason that China, of all countries, and is really unique in this, has been able to achieve this level of development and advancement without recourse to imperialism, without recourse to the imperialist playbook of war and proxy war and unilateral sanctions and destabilization and assassinations and coups and economic coercion and so on. There's got to be a reason that China, of all the major countries, has been able to deal with the COVID pandemic in a relatively sane way and save millions and millions of lives in the process. China suffered 100,000 or so deaths as a result of COVID, which of course is a very sad number. But if China had followed the same sort of principles of COVID management that were followed in the US or Britain, it would have suffered between 4 and 5 million deaths. And that's something that's been recognized by the World Health Organization and many other bodies. And what's special about China? What's different about China? I don't think you can explain anything if we say, well, China's just another capitalist country, right? To my mind, we can only explain these successes if we recognize that there's something different about China, i.e., that it's a socialist country, that it has a Communist Party-led government, that has a Marxist worldview, and that political power is dominated by that Communist Party and wielded by and on behalf of the working classes. And the capitalist, there is a capitalist class in China. There are billionaires in China. There are very rich people in China, but they're not able to dominate political power. They're not even allowed to organize as a class. You can't form a bourgeois political party. There's multiple political parties in China, but none of them represent the interests of the capitalist class. So, capitalists are literally denied the freedom to organize, to mobilize for capitalism around the interests of the bourgeoisie. And people get very confused when they look at China, and I kind of understand that. I think it's very understandable, because you go to Beijing, you go to Shanghai, you go to Guangzhou, you go to Hangzhou, wherever, big cities in China, and you'll see KFC, and you'll see McDonald's, and you'll see Starbucks. And China has a few hundred billionaires, and China has enormous quantities of private capital, and China has quite horrifying levels of inequality. There's no doubt about it, although the inequality is somewhat different to what we experience here, in the sense that, like, even though there is a vast gulf between the very rich and the very poor, even the very poor in China are in a fundamentally different situation to the very poor. Certainly elsewhere in Asia, for example, in India. My dad's from India. I've been to India many times. You really don't have to walk very far out of Indira Gandhi International Airport to see intense poverty, to see hundreds and thousands of people living in filth and squalor in peri-urban slums. I live in North London. I can walk 50 or 100 meters from my front door, and I can see plenty of homeless people on the nearest high street. You don't see that in China. So, even where people are poor in China, especially now as a result of the targeted poverty alleviation campaign, they may be poor, they may be cash poor, but they've got a home, they've got a roof over their heads, they've got water piped into their home, they've got electricity piped into their home, their children get a guaranteed minimum of 9 years free education, they've got access to healthcare, they've got access to clothing, and those things are absolutely guaranteed by the state. So in that sense, that puts them into a very different category of poverty to the one that we're used to thinking about. And certainly if you compare it to other developing countries elsewhere in South Asia or Southeast Asia or Central Asia or Africa, Latin America, and so on. But nonetheless, China's got these things. It's got billionaires, and it's got private capital, it's got KFC. I mean, I'm a communist and I fight for socialism. I've kind of always assumed KFC and billionaires are pretty much the first thing we'll get rid of once we've had a revolution, right? But China is following its own very specific and complex path. They introduced market reforms in a very intentional way for very specific reasons, in order to develop their technology, in order to develop their productive forces, in order to shift from being a relatively backward country to being an advanced country, so that they could catch up in science and technology, so that they could attract capital, so that they could grow their economy, and along with that, improve living standards and create the conditions to move forward to a more advanced socialism. And ultimately, if the proof of the pudding is in the eating, you have to look at China today and say, well, they've been very successful in that. Like, they have been able to catch up. They have become this massive science and technology powerhouse. Okay, they've integrated into the global capitalist system, essentially. They're integrated into global value chains and all the rest of it. But that gives them a significant level of security and safety that the Soviet Union never had, in the sense that the costs of decoupling from China, the costs of breaking from China, or the costs of going to war with China are incredibly high, because China is absolutely crucial to the functioning of the global economy. And China is the largest trading partner of 2/3 of the world's countries. And you've got 150, 155, 160 countries that are signed up to the Belt and Road Initiative, for example. And Chinese people are living way better than they used to be. And in terms of the fight against poverty, and in terms of creating the foundations for advancing to a more developed form of socialism, you have to say they're in a much better place than they were. Which is not to say that I think that they've done everything right and that they've never made any mistakes, and which is not to say that there aren't really significant risks and dangers to what they've done. Of course, they've introduced, they've created essentially a capitalist class, a group of people that own and deploy capital, and that have their own specific interests, which are not always aligned with the interests of a socialist society. They've open themselves up to foreign capital and foreign investment. They're part of these global value chains. They're susceptible to fluctuations in the global economy. Like along with foreign capital has come a certain level of foreign influence and foreign like imperialist ideology. The stereotype of China is that it's like this monolithic and authoritarian state where no one's allowed to think anything that isn't Xi Jinping thought. Actually, they very much follow a policy of letting 100 flowers bloom. And some of those flowers are pretty rotten. People believe all sorts of things in China. It's a very pluralistic society. But along with that comes some bourgeois ideology and some people with reactionary ideas. So there's any number of dangers and risks associated with the path that they've taken. And I think that they've kind of accepted that knowingly on the basis that the benefits outweigh the risks. And I would put it to you that there's never been a socialist experiment in history that has not been swimming in an ocean of risk and danger and threat. The same was certainly true for the Soviet Union. The same was certainly true for the Eastern and Central European people's democracies. The same is true for Cuba today. Does anyone seriously think that the Cubans are just relaxed and resting on their laurels, safe and secure in the knowledge that their socialist project will continue forever and isn't under meaningful risk from outside and internal causes? Is people's career without threat and without risk? Is Vietnam, is Laos, is Venezuela, is Nicaragua? Of course not. As long as we live in a country that continues to be dominated by imperialism, then any socialist project is going to be inevitably incredibly risky, incredibly dangerous, and incredibly difficult and complex. And ultimately, if we're socialists, if we're Marxists, if we uphold socialist thinking and socialist society, why on earth would we ascribe China's successes to capitalism? Well, how does that benefit us in any way? If capitalism can achieve what China's achieved in terms of poverty alleviation, in terms of improving people's lives, in terms of green energy and biodiversity protection, in terms of developing a foreign policy of non-interference, in terms of developing a foreign policy of peaceful coexistence, well, frankly, as Marxists, we probably have to rethink what we've been saying about capitalism for the last 150 years since the publication of Capital, right? My view is, on the contrary, we've been right about capitalism all along. The China's successors are the successors of socialism, are the successors of our global movement, the global movement that we are a part of. And we should celebrate that. We should let that inspire us. We should learn from it. We should show solidarity with it. And we should reject the slanders that are thrown at it. And yeah, that's it for my introductory remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carlos. We will move now to having questions or comments from people. If you want to raise your hand, and I see some applause going on. Thank you very much. That's awesome. I love this technology. So we have I'm going to start with John C. Palmer. If Andy, you can unmute John C. We're still not hearing you, however. How's your volume?
Yeah, I unmuted Jonse, but there might be an audio issue.
We'll wait a second and see what happens. Jonse, you trying it? Can you speak so we know if you're working?
Can you guys hear me now?
Now we can. Yeah, let's go.
Yeah, sorry about that. Carlos, thank you so much for that talk, and thank you for writing this book. Unfortunately, I don't have my copy yet, but it's in the mail. So really looking forward to reading it. You mentioned earlier that the market is full of lots of different books and various bourgeois perspectives on the Chinese socialist experiment. One of them that I've read recently is Ku Jin's The New China Playbook that came out this year, which is getting a lot of popularity, I think. And the subtitle of that book is Beyond Socialism or Capitalism, but it's very much arguing for China's success being due to capitalism, kind of like you were alluding to. And I think, since we have a lot of folks on this call who are general members of Freedom Road, who are like starting to learn more about political economy, I want to ask about the theory of surplus value in China, and how that is understood within the socialist context, where people are trying, the Chinese people are trying to build socialism, and what it looks like still having a wage system within China today, and kind of like what that means for transitioning from socialism to communism.
Tom, how do you want to roll? Do you want to take a few questions and then I'll come back?
Go ahead. We'll go with that one.
Okay. Well, I should start by recommending another book, which goes a lot deeper into the economics than my book does, which is by Professor Cheng-En Fu, who is like one of the leading kind of economists and theoreticians at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. It's called China's Economic Dialectic. It's actually been produced by International Publishers, NYC, and it's got an intro by John Bellamy Foster, a monthly review. And it's really good. I mean, I'm only halfway through it, but it goes into a lot of detail as to how China's economic system works and what China's economic trajectory is. So that's a recommendation which will give you a lot better information than I can. I haven't actually read the Ku Jin book. I mean, Ku Jin is at the very least like a friend of China. Like she's supportive, and in these times of intense anti-China hostility, I'll take that, fair enough. She ascribes China's successes to capitalism. The same is the case for Jeffrey Sachs, who is obviously, if nothing else, he's a bourgeois economist, although his views on geopolitics seem to be increasingly sound. If you read Sachs on China, then as far as he's concerned, the first 30 years, the first 3 decades of socialist construction from 1949 until the start of reform period in 1978 were a disaster in economic terms. And then they introduced reforms from 1978 onwards, and the economy really starts to take off. I mean, it's a completely absurd. I mean, it's the view that you would expect bourgeois economies to take, because in terms of GDP growth, if the only statistic you're interested in is GDP growth, then yes, like the best time to be in China was the 1990s. But the simple fact is that life expectancy, which is, in my view, economically speaking, a far more interesting metric, like how long do people live? Are people dying from unnatural causes? Are they dying from starvation? Are they dying from curable diseases and so on? That increased. If it was 35 in 1949, then by the time Mao died in 76, by the time of the launch of economic reforms, it was more like 65, which is like the most precipitous increase in life expectancy anywhere in the world. So clearly something happened economically in China that was conducive to people living better and living longer. So this whole idea that the first 3 decades of socialist construction were a disaster is completely unsupportable. And the Chinese certainly don't say that. And this is one thing that Xi Jinping in particular has been very strong on. It's like, we don't engage in historical nihilism. We don't put a great wall and a big dividing line between the first 3 decades and the following period of reform and opening up. They're both a part of the same project, and the reform program wouldn't have been possible without those initial decades of socialist construction. As for how surplus value operates in China, It's complicated, but essentially the formula is largely that people are paid according to their work on a wages basis, and surplus value very much exists in China. And even though a bit less than half of the economy is run by state-owned enterprises, their profit-making concerns, and people work for them. Like, generally speaking, conditions are better. Wages are not so good for the state-owned enterprises, but generally speaking, conditions are very good. Retirement age is like 55. Social welfare provisions are extremely good, and so on. But a system of surplus value still operates. It was funny, I was on a Communist Party's delegation in China in June, and we had a really nice exchange with the All China Federation of Trade Unions. And one of the leaders of the Finnish Communist Party said, well, in Finland, we're talking about the potential for mandating a 6-hour working day. And what do you think about that? What are the chances of a 6-hour working day introduced being in China? And she's speaking to a very high-level senior trade union official, and he slightly, in a slightly impolitic way, once he'd heard the translation, allowed himself a little chuckle before answering, and said, "Look, China's a developing country, and if it were to mandate a 6-hour working day, it would stop developing, or it would massively slow down its development. So from our point of view, as a Communist Party and as the trade unions, we want to ensure that people do work and that they get paid fairly for their work. And if people are doing overtime, they're not doing it because they're coerced into doing it, and that they get paid. But if people want to work more and earn more money, then we very much encourage that." So yeah, I don't know if I properly answered your question, but there's some ideas.
All right, great. Let's have Musa Bey give us a question or make a comment, and then we'll have Eric and Sebastian, followed by Dan.
Hello. So I'm new to the party, and this is like my first official event with you guys.
Nice.
But I do have a question for the author. As an author who also writes books about socialism and communism, how do you feel like China's economy, socialist economy, parallels to other communist countries or other socialist countries?
Let's do that one.
Great. Yeah, I mean, there's a huge range of economic systems in socialist countries, current and past. Like Vietnam has basically pretty much exactly the same economic system as China. It operates in an extremely similar way, probably about a decade behind if China started its reform program in 1978, and Vietnam introduced its Doi Moi reforms in, I think, 1986. But both define themselves as socialist market economies. Both have economic system which is top level planned and which works on the basis of 5-year plans in good old-fashioned Stalinist fashion, and both have very heavy government regulation. In both systems, you've got the major banks under government control, so the allocation of financial resources, like what projects get supported and what projects don't get supported, is defined ultimately by the state, which is responsible not to shareholders, but to the people. So Vietnam is very similar. DPRK operates still, I would say, a much more kind of traditional, centrally planned economy, with some level of flirtation with special economic zones and introducing some market mechanisms. But I mean, it's very difficult to talk meaningfully about the DPRK's economy because everything that is experienced by the DPRK, like their plans are so kind of distorted by the geopolitical situation and by the sanction, like, you know, suffocating sanctions, and the United States and its allies, you know, desperate attempts to bring down North Korean socialism and to suffocate the North Korean people. Cuba also has a more traditional centrally planned economy, which probably suffers from some of the same sort of problems that the Soviet Union suffered from in the late 1970s and 1980s. Some level of kind of stagnation, a lack of kind of revolutionary enthusiasm, and I think that's something that really affected China as well in the 1970s, and it seems to be a common theme for socialist experiences. Like you get out of what Lasordo refers to as the heroic stage, like the first generation or the first two generations of the revolution, where people remember what it used to be like. They remember the incredible sacrifices, the heroic sacrifices that have been made by that first generation of revolutionaries, and they're highly motivated to contribute to this collective project. By the time you get to the third or fourth generation, you know, you return to some kind of new normality where most people just want to get on with their lives, and they want to go to work, and they want to get paid, and they want food on the table, and they want their kids to have a decent education, and so on and so forth. So how to motivate people in that situation, I think, you know, the Chinese and the Vietnamese have essentially answered that question by the use of market mechanisms, which is, you know, obviously, historically speaking, it's a concession to capitalism. It's a concession to hundreds or thousands of years of class society, essentially, and entrenched habits. Because, you know, when we build socialism and we carry out a revolution, we're not starting afresh. We're not starting from scratch. We're not creating a utopian society. We carry a whole heap of baggage, a whole heap of inheritance from the societies that we came from, and China's definitely made concessions to that in order to solve particular problems, and I think it's been highly successful in doing that. And I think that Cuba's probably done a lot of study of China's process and has been looking to incorporate some of those mechanisms, and is working with China on incorporating some market mechanisms, albeit in a very limited way, and with an understanding that, you know, market socialism isn't a magic wand, and it's not the new dogma that you can just apply everywhere. Like the way China has been able to develop was very specific to China's circumstances. The fact that China's a huge country, the fact that it had this enormous peasantry, the fact that it was able to set up a few decades of relative peace, the fact that it had this large, basically patriotic and generally pretty wealthy kind of expat community that was willing to invest in China when it decided to engage in reforms, which was not something that was ever open to the Soviet Union. So yeah, Cuba continues to have a different system. Laos continues to have a very different system based on its own specific circumstances. And Venezuela and Nicaragua, which are countries that I would define as being kind of on the road to socialism or socialist oriented, both operate kind of mixed economies. Yeah, I don't know if that answered the question at all. Sorry, I'm rambling.
No, you're not rambling at all. You hit on I was thinking of other questions, and then you answered them too. So you're leading us to where we're thinking about things. We're going to ask Eric to speak next.
Hi, comrade. Listen, I don't really so much have a question. We actually sort of know each other. I'm GV Motorola on Facebook, so we've talked a couple of times on Facebook. I'm a general member of Road Socialist Organization. We have a study group on socialism with Chinese characteristics, and we've found your work to be so helpful as a way to introduce people that don't have a lot of background on the subject of socialism in China. It's a very accessible work, but it doesn't shy away from getting into some of the real issues, and especially the international context that that socialism with Chinese characteristics has developed in. And the things that we've been reading Roland Boer's book. You mentioned Cheng and Fu's book. We want to get to that also, and we're also thinking of getting into Xu Hongji and Qin Shun's Basics of the System of Chinese Characteristics. I think one of the strongest points of your book is how it emphasizes the continuity of CPC policy since the foundation of New China in 1949. I think that there's been much more continuity than rupture in CPC policy and ideological orientation historically. And I think that that's, especially in the context of the debates going on the left right now, I think that's a very useful way of looking at things, because I think that there's sometimes in some countries in the left, there's a problem with ultra leftism, and they take a dim view of how China's developing. But I think that if they really knew a little bit more about the history of the party's line that you've set forward in that book, I think it would be helpful in bridging those sorts of gaps. You know what I mean? In understanding. So, like I said, I didn't really have a question. I just think that the work you're doing is really good and it's very useful, and we've gotten a lot out of it. So thanks a lot, comrade.
That's great to hear. Thanks a lot, Eric. And fantastic to see you in an environment that isn't Facebook.
Right on. Thank you, Eric. Say hello to Chicago for me. Next, we're going to hear from Sebastian.
Hi, Carlos. Thank you so much. What a wonderful talk. Yeah, I especially liked how you pointed out how there's more to development than just GDP, life expectancy, homelessness. Like, that's all really important. I'll be super quick with my question. You brought up how there's a difference between like imperialism and like kind of the technical Marxist-Leninist sense, like, the sense that matters, and Chinese like foreign direct investment. And I think it would be really educational to like elaborate on that. Yeah, that's it. I want to hear your thoughts.
Excellent.
Do you mean in terms of China's investment in other countries? Cool, yeah, that's an interesting question and an important one, and one that comes up quite a lot. And yeah, one of the key things that I try to debunk in the book is this idea of China as an imperialist country, which has become, it's kind of a commonplace idea now. Hillary Clinton says it. Hillary Clinton warns us about emerging Chinese colonialism in Africa and Latin America. Rex Tillerson said it. Your boy Antony Blinken has said it. And the irony and the levels, the lack of self-awareness is pretty incredible. But if this is imperialism, it's a incredibly innocuous imperialism. Like, I think if you spoke to some of the people in Africa and the Middle East and Latin America and the Pacific, they'd probably like to try a bit of this imperialism, because it looks so different to what they've been used to. When they've been, if we talk about what imperialism has looked like throughout history, like the British Empire, the transatlantic slave trade, the system of slavery in the Americas, the expansion of the United States to incorporate the whole country, and accompanying genocide of the native peoples, and pillage of their lands, what imperialism has looked like in Africa, even including neo-colonialism and modern imperialism, with structural adjustment programs and debt traps, and economic coercion and conditional loans, where if you've needed an emergency loan in the 1970s and 1980s, if you're the Democratic Republic of Congo and you want an emergency loan from the IMF, then, well, yeah, you can get your money to get you through this drought. but you've got to privatize your water system, and you've got to privatize your education system, and you've got to open up your economy to multinationals, and you've got to stop growing whatever you're growing, and let us dump our surplus corn on you, and in the process destroy the entire structure of your food system. You know, that's what imperialism looks like. Imperialism also looks like genocidal wars in Korea, in Vietnam, in Yugoslavia, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Libya, in Syria, in Yemen. It looks like the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. It looks like the coup and the murder of 3 million communists in Indonesia, the coup in Brazil, the 1973 coup in Chile, that got rid of an elected Marxist government of Salvador Allende and replaced it with the military dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet. Like, that's what imperialism looks like. So if Chinese imperialism looks like loaning some money and investing in some projects that a given government is interested in, like on completely equal terms, which is all negotiated and conducted, you know, from country to country and company to company on the basis of equals, then, well, this is a new type of imperialism. Kind of doesn't sound so bad. And actually, these accusations of imperialism, these accusations of land grabs, these accusations of debt traps and so on, you never hear them from the putative victims of these crimes. You know, Venezuela doesn't complain about its relationship with China. Sri Lanka doesn't complain about its relationship with China. Bangladesh doesn't complain. Zimbabwe doesn't complain. Ethiopia doesn't complain. South Africa doesn't complain. These are all countries where China has a huge amount of investment, loans money, is involved in any number of projects. The simple fact of the matter is that Chinese financing and Chinese support, and in many places Chinese aid, are helping these countries to develop, which is what they want. And that's kind of the nub. That's kind of the core of the argument, I think, is that colonial and imperialist systems have held these countries in underdevelopment for centuries, for 500 years, and China's helping to support them to break out of that, to break out of the cycle of underdevelopment and to develop and to become more advanced. You know, Ethiopia is a classic example. In the 1980s, it was pretty recently, like it's in my lifetime, I remember it, Ethiopia being considered as like the quintessential basket case country that was characterized by mass poverty and starvation. And we had to donate to Live Aid so that Ethiopian people could get an airdrop of some millet, etc. Now, like the Chinese have built the first metro system in sub-Saharan Africa in Addis Ababa. They've played a key part in building the Addis Ababa-Djibouti railway, which is a major kind of nexus of development in the country. They've gifted new headquarters to the African Union, which is also in Addis Ababa. They've gifted new headquarters of the African Center for Disease Control, also in Addis Ababa. And they have a very positive symbiotic relationship where they're helping Ethiopia to develop. They open their markets up for Ethiopian products. So it's not just a one-way direction of travel in terms of their trade. So, you know, ultimately, Chinese financing, Chinese investment is helping countries in ways that they want to be helped. It's done on a reciprocal and on the basis of equality without any element of coercion. So if that's imperialism, you know, I mean, it's not imperialism ultimately. And to call it imperialism, you have to have an ulterior motive of denigrating China.
Thanks for that answer. You know, I saw train lines in Venezuela that the Chinese were building, and they connected cities and places within the country of Venezuela, as opposed to the ones the US built were all for export and only for export. And, you know, it's just, you know, a very different economic purpose based on a model of developing Venezuela instead of profits for Wall Street. Anyway, We have Dan next. You're up, Dan.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Carlos, and for particularly that last question. And your response was super helpful. I have a friend that's close to the people's movement in the Philippines, and I try to be mindful of like international solidarity with people's movements around the world. And so, for the forefront of my mind is the anti-Chinese sentiment that goes on in the U.S. and the historical colonialism within the Philippines by the U.S., the ongoing U.S. militarization in the Philippines. So, like again, like in comparison, I do my best to to put things in right perspective. Simultaneously, that particular friend had maybe less than popular views on the relationship between China and the people's movement in the Philippines. So I would just be curious to hear what elaboration you might have on that, if any, sort of along those lines of wanting to remain nuanced and in support of people's movements globally.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for opening that can of worms. Look, I mean, I've got the utmost respect for the CPP and for the liberation struggle that the CPP and NDA and NPA have been waging for many decades. And I think that Jose Maria Sison, for example, as the kind of figurehead of that movement, has done incredible and really important work at a both theoretical and practical level. I mean, I think their analysis of China is essentially incorrect and is ultra left and is founded on a basic somewhat dogmatic understanding, but also, like, I think it also relates to like very long-standing complicated dynamics of the countries in the area, which predate 1949 by a long way, like disputed territories, the fact that China's always been a big country, that China's always been kind of the center of gravity in East Asia, and China's always had this kind of sense of its own importance. Even the name of the country as Zhongguo, as the Middle Kingdom, that's kind of how it tends to think of itself, and that makes its relations in a modern state system, with a UN Charter and international law under which all countries are equal, complicated, and so there's this tension between kind of nationalism and socialism, which is very difficult to navigate, and that the Chinese don't always get it right, and I don't think anyone always gets it right. The tensions between China and Vietnam are, I would say, even more complicated and even more significant than the tensions between China and Philippines, and the disagreements between the Communist Party of China and the Communist Party of the Philippines. Yeah, I mean, I basically tend to think that some of that quite harsh critique of China would go away were the Filipino communists in power, because they'd realized that building socialism is really difficult. That once you manage to take power, that's kind of just the first problem out of the way, as Ho Chi Minh once commented, and well, I think he wrote in one of his poems, you get to the top of the mountain and you just realize there's a load more mountains. And the Filipinos would probably find themselves needing Chinese support in much the same way. I mean, Prachanda and the Nepali Maoists were always pretty critical of socialism with Chinese characteristics until they're in power, and now they're best friends with China. But these things are very complicated, and I'm very hesitant to just say these people who've given their lives, generations who've given their lives to the revolution and engaged in real armed struggle, and they're not sitting in relative comfort in North London like I am, writing books and on nice Zoom calls talking about China from a, in a quite abstract way. They're engaged in the struggle. So I don't actually want to criticize them. Like, I don't completely agree with their analysis, and I think there's some kind of dogmatic elements to it, but that they've absolutely got a right to their opinion, and they've got every right to engage in that debate, and they deserve a hearing.
All right, thanks for those questions. There must be some more comments or questions. We still have about 20 minutes left if people want. I'll stay on for much longer, as long as our guest is willing to talk. Interesting to hear you. Avril, you get to speak next.
Yeah, I was just I don't really have that much of a big comment because the chat box is disabled. So in lieu of that, I'd like to say thank you for answering the previous question, because I've always thought about that as well, since I know there's conflicts between like the Communist Party of the Philippines and like the Communist Party of China. And it's like kind of, like you have to balance it, because like you don't want to give into like the new Cold War against China, and you also don't want to condemn national liberation movements, and you don't really want to like try to seem like you in a more privileged position can really like decide like how exactly to solve those types of disagreements. So I appreciate that clarification. Yes, thank you.
Well, maybe I'll take a moment just to say that for the Freedom Road Socialist Organization, we support 5 countries that we say are socialist, and Laos, Vietnam, Cuba, People's Korea, and China. And we simply disagree with other parties about some things, and we debate them. And the debates can sometimes be sharp, especially when our leaders are sitting down and discussing important matters, because we actually are in solidarity. We actually support parties that are fighting in other countries or struggling like we are within the imperialist countries. And it'd be pretty boring if we always agreed anyway. But we actually debate for the purpose of consolidating our relationships and strengthening our movements. And those challenges are welcomed by other parties, even if sometimes it gets sharp, or people leave the room a little miffed with each other. It's important to have those debates and discussions. And we have a fairly lively internal debate in our Congress period as well. So, comrades can disagree, but once we vote on matters, comrades are expected to carry out the unity of the party here in the United States too. So I think you probably understand that in London as well. But we're as close as can be with the Filipino comrades. We just disagree, and so then we debate.
Yeah, and I think that's really important. And I think our movement is still learning some of the lessons of the Sino-Soviet split. And there's a really telling comment. I guess it was kind of a throwaway comment to some degree, from Kim Il-sung to a visiting Chinese vice premier in 1965. He said, "Yeah, the Soviet leaders are revisionists, but they're not enemies." And yeah, I think that kind of sums it up quite nicely. We should have these sharp debates whilst at the same time remembering that we are all comrades, that we are all on the same side. And Chung and Fu in that China's Economic Dialectic book touches on this as well. I'll just read you a little quote from it. He says, "The Sino-Soviet debate led to a deterioration of the relations between the two parties and countries, and to a split in the international communist movement, with the divisions then being utilized by the United States and other Western countries to attack Marxism, to attack socialism, to attack the communist movement as a whole. And the lessons of this experience were painful, and they still need to be subject to reflection." And I think that's a really important idea. And you can see how even today, like the tensions, historic tensions between China and Vietnam, how the US is trying to leverage those for its own advantage today. So there's many, many lessons that we had to learn from the Sino-Soviet split, and how to engage in serious but comradely debate is one of them.
Thank you. We're going to have Masao Suzuki speak next.
Hi, first of all, I'd like to thank Carlos for doing this program for us. I think it's been great. And I'm mainly speaking because I thought I heard a call for more questions, because I more have comments on two things having to do with the economy. And I should preface these by saying I haven't seriously studied the socialist economies in about 20 years. But I know at that time there were two things that came up. One is on this issue of GDP growth between, the original period and the market reform period. It really all depends on what you think the GDP of China was in 1949. And it was incredibly low. China had been occupied by Japan for 10 years and then had a civil war. And so it was much, much lower, for example, than say India was in 1949, even though India was a colonial country. And so within a reasonable range of estimates, and I'm not saying I'm going for this, but if you took the low estimate of China's GDP in 1949, you could fashion an argument saying GDP actually grew faster 1949 to 1978. I'm not saying that's what happened, but we can't really know what happened. So anyway, that's where GDP is squishy. And I do appreciate you raising the issue of lifespan, which is better documented. And I just wanted to throw in that recent figures show China's lifespan, average lifespan, has surpassed the United States, not because it has been rising steadily, but unfortunately here in the United States, the lifespan has actually been going down, right? Which is not even indicative of other imperialist countries. So that's something to say. The second thing I wanted to say is just on 20 years ago, and I know it's different now, but 20 years ago, there's a narrative of the evil communist Cuba, right? And China's not so bad because it's becoming capitalist. And of course, a lot of people were, and some are still are. But part of that comes from the press here taking a very biased view, in particular on the issue of foreign investment, that at that time, this is 2003, the percent of GDP that was foreign investment in Cuba was actually larger than in China. But the difference, of course, was there was no American foreign investment in Cuba, right? Whereas there's significant American foreign investment in China. So people are like, oh yeah, Starbucks and KFC and GM still has a joint production agreement. And nothing like that in Cuba because of the US embargo. But what was in Cuba was significant amounts of European capital, especially Spanish, and some amount of Latin American capital, mainly Mexican, and it was really concentrated in the tourism sector. But I just think and these were just from, bourgeois statistics in 2003. So we should be careful that the narrative here in the United States is not just, capitalist narrative, but it's also very US centric, right? And foreign investment really means US foreign investment. Anyway, that's all. And thank you again for speaking.
Thank you very much. Those are very interesting, useful comments. And, since you bring up Cuba and since we've been talking to some degree about the Sino-Soviet split, I think Cuba and China and their relationship of, very deep solidarity and friendship, especially, since the late 80s and since the reestablishment of relations and since, the tragic collapse of the Soviet Union, they've really blazed a trail in terms of bringing the communist movement back to being one global communist movement, and creating a mainstream of Marxism that is represented by or led by the socialist countries collectively. Cuba obviously tended to orient towards the Soviet side during the Sino-Soviet split, but China provided a huge amount of support for Cuba, which is not very well known during the special period. One example is in, I think, 1993, just as the Cubans were embarking on the special period, they had very little fuel because they used to get all their fuel basically from the Soviet Union. They would get a huge amount of fuel at subsidized prices. They would use 70% of it, and 30% of it they'd sell on the world market at world market prices. And that's how they would get their kind of foreign reserves up. So they had a big crisis. And one thing that China did, like the city of Beijing gifted 1 million bicycles to the city of Havana, which was a big act of solidarity for, China in 1993 was still a poor country itself. Its GDP per capita would have been well under that of Cuba's at the time. And they've continued to have, very strong blossoming relations. And yeah, I think all the 5 countries that you've mentioned, China, Cuba, DPRK, Laos, Vietnam, have extremely close party-to-party relations, and in my view, collectively provide the leadership for our global movement.
So I'm going to ask you a question, and it's something, if you're in conversations, we speculate about. So I won't hold you to a higher standard than speculation, but a lot of people say the U.S. is surrounding China, the war with Russia in the Ukraine, which is a proxy war. That the U.S. is at some point going to go to war with China, or that China will reunite its renegade province in Taiwan with China. Do you have any thoughts about what the future holds with the U.S. and China?
Well, I just think there are so many variables there that it's kind of an impossible task to work out what's gonna proceed. I think China's played the game very well. It's managed to develop in conditions of relative peace for 45 years now, and has taken advantage of that to really advance its productive forces, to get more prosperous, and to become an undeniable global power. And it's changed its orientation a little bit. The Deng Xiaoping slogan was "Hide our strength and bide our time." They're doing less of that now. They're certainly doing less of hiding their strength, and are taking a much more active role in global diplomacy. For example, in relation to like that, they've had this diplomatic coup of facilitating a rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which is obviously huge and unexpected, but a bombshell as far as, and a very unwelcome one as far as the imperialists are concerned. They're playing an interesting and a useful role in trying to bring about some sort of peaceful resolution to the crisis in Ukraine. I'm sure they will play a useful role in trying to bring about a peaceful resolution to the Palestinian question and the creation of a Palestinian state, and the goal of winning national dignity and self-determination for the Palestinian people. And in the course of all this, they've really managed to unite basically the entire global South and the non-imperialist world on their side. Russia-China relations are better than they've ever been since, let's say, the mid-1950s, at the height of kind of Soviet support to socialist China. Ironically, it took Russia becoming a capitalist country to end that sort of level of competitiveness, I suppose. But, you know, they have very close symbiotic relations. China has extremely good relations with Iran. It has extremely good relations with the African Union. It increasingly has very good relations with ASEAN, with the countries of Southeast Asia, and with Latin America, particularly the progressive countries in Latin America. You know, China has excellent relations with with Cuba, with Venezuela, with Nicaragua, with Bolivia, and so on. So all of these things make it actually very difficult for the US to do what it's trying to do. You know, they keep hitting out in all directions, to use a slight Mao catchphrase. They are attempting to sanction China to prevent it from spreading its network infrastructure, but they've been completely successful in that. You know, you've got dozens of countries around the world saying, well, you're trying to persuade us not to use Huawei 5G technology, but what you've got to offer is not as good and it's double the price. So what's in it for us? And the Americans don't have an answer to that question. They've obviously worked very, very hard to try and prevent China from becoming a major power in the field of semiconductors, which is a geopolitically very important question. It's not just about who's got the best computers and who's got the best phones. It's about the technology that's going to power, you know, the next wave of innovation going forward. And the Americans are really keen to try and control that. So they pulled out all the stops to prevent China from becoming a semiconductor power. What does China do? SMIC, China Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, produces like a top of the range 5G enabled semiconductor, which is then used for the latest Huawei phone. And now, you know, every analyst was saying 2 years ago, whenever they first introduced chip sanctions on China, that this is going to set them back by 20 years. They're not going to be able to catch up for decades. Now they're maybe like a year, maximum 2 years behind. So, you know, they're playing every trick. They're trying every trick, and thus far none of them have been successful. At some point, as I kind of alluded to in my talk, my introductory talk, they're going to come to the realization that, well, we haven't got many opportunities left other than war. But then, you know, waging war is not a decision that can be taken lightly in these days of mutually assured destruction. You know, it's kind of an unfashionable point to make, and it's something I'd probably be a bit shy about if I was giving a talk in the peace movement. But the fact is that the system of mutually assured destruction between the US and the Soviet Union was very effective, because there hasn't been a world war since 1945, and you know, since the Soviet Union developed nuclear weapons in 1948, I believe it was, there hasn't been a nuclear attack. And in that sense, you know, the Soviet nuclear arsenal and today China's nuclear arsenal and other countries' nuclear arsenal play a very important role in maintaining global peace. And I think, you know, that logic continues to apply. So I don't think it's just like the US can just decide to go to war on China and think that that's a risk-free proposition and that they're going to do well out of it. You know, China is prepared to defend itself. China is a nuclear country. China is also the only country to have no first use and a commitment to never use nuclear weapons against a non-nuclear country policy. But yeah, China is a nuclear country. China is able to defend itself. China is modernizing its military, and I think that's an important process. So, you know, I wouldn't necessarily predict there'll be a war. Certainly there'll be saber rattling. But, you know, there's so much complexity there. There's so much contradiction there, because there's a big section of the US ruling class which is like, well, all these actions that we're taking against China are completely self-defeating. You tell us that we can't sell chips to China. Well, that means that you've cut out our biggest market. That's going to reduce our revenue. That's going to reduce the amount that we can put into research and development. Meanwhile, the Chinese are just going to create their own advanced chips. So they'll be making them themselves from now on, because they can't buy them from us. and they'll be making more profit, and they can invest more in research and development, and they're going to overtake us. So the whole thing is a classic example of picking up a rock to drop it on our feet. So, you know, I think like humanity is on a trajectory towards a multipolar and a multilateral system of international relations based essentially on the principles of the UN Charter and based on the principles of the Bandung Conference of non-interference and peaceful coexistence. But that's a road that's got a lot of twists and turns, and we just have to see what happens and play our part and fight our corner.
Very good. Thank you for that. I want to point out to our members who are on the call, we've retained more people than typical. I would like to thank you for that, Carlos. Usually we have a lot more fall off, but you've kept people's attention and interest. I'd also like to point out that Masao Suzuki is part of our national leadership, who just made the previous comments, and he is in particular responsible for our work in the national movements in the United States, which are very important to the United Front and our strategy for revolution, which is the United Front. So members can get to know Masao Suzuki too. Do you have any last or final comments you'd like to make? Because I think we're going to wrap up, and I want to say how much we appreciate that you wrote the book. You express many of the views that we talk about internally, and also hit on some of the debates that we have with other comrades, both in the movements within the United States, within the communist movement of the United States. You know, we're far from the only group that exists here, though we do seem to be growing at a good clip, and we're well based in the working class in comparison to some others, and in the national movements as well. But you know, you've done us a favor by doing the hard work of writing a book that's very useful and helpful to us, especially you know, our view of China and socialism in China, based on the rule of the working class. You know, we base our view of socialism on whether there's a dictatorship of the proletariat or not, and that's definitional for us. And so your book helps us, arms us to have those debates with others, and we appreciate that. Would you like to make any final comments?
Yeah, thanks very much, Tom. I mean, I've yabbered on long enough, so I don't want to say any more other than thank you so much for inviting me. It's been great. It's been a real honor, and it's been a really interesting and useful and enjoyable discussion. So I hope you will feel the same way. I would say, like, not that it's my place to do so, but I think it would be well worth the leadership reaching out to CPC to establish bilateral relations. I think they're in a place where they're increasingly open to that, and you know, that kind of sets the ground to have bilateral delegations to visit China, you know, for your members to visit China and get a feel for what it's like on the ground, which can be very useful as well. So that will be worth doing, and as a recommendation. But yeah, again, thank you very much, and hope to see you another time.
Thank you. Red salute to you, comrade. Solidarity. Get out in the streets for Palestine. Show up at the National Alliance Conference this weekend in Chicago. You're very welcome. Thank you all for participating. All right, good night.